Monday night, thank you for joining us. I am Thabo Mdluli and your reporting continues. What are the legal ramifications of former President Jacob Zuma's no-show at the Zondo Commission? Associate Professor of Public Law at the University of Cape Town, Richard Calland, joins me now to talk about this. Richard, good evening and thank you very much for your time. An 11th hour attempt by the top brass of the ANC to try and convince President Jacob Zuma to appear at the commission. Well, it's a little bit too late now. We know he didn't appear. But what they said coming out of the NEC this weekend was that his arrest would plunge us into a constitutional crisis. Do you agree?
No, I don't see this as a constitutional crisis. It may well lead to a political crisis. In fact, I suspect we're on the verge of quite a serious political crisis that will certainly give the ANC leadership and many stakeholders within the broader ANC family not just pause for thought, but probably a great deal of consternation going forward. That needs to play itself out, and that's really a matter for the ANC, although, of course, as ever in South Africa, what happens in the ANC tends to have a significant impact on everybody else, including government. And it may even, in the longer run, play into the question of whether or not Cyril Ramaphosa gets a second term. At the end of next year, there's an important 5-yearly national elective conference. Yeah. And of course, there is a convergence now with the Ace Magashule matter, the Secretary General matter. But these are political matters. Back to your question, a constitutional crisis, as I said earlier today, I don't believe it is, because what is happening here is that the former president, Jacob Zuma, is seeking to destabilize and delegitimize important legal processes, such as the Zondo Commission, such as the Constitutional Court, the highest court of the land. But the Constitution is holding firm, and it is holding the line, and it is playing out in its normal way. So that's not a constitutional crisis. In my book, a constitutional crisis is when there is an irreconcilable clash or dilemma between different bits of the constitutional system. We don't have that. He's a former president, not an actual president, and he will be treated like any other citizen.
And Richard, is that not the problem here? Is the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture not paying the price for showing deference for a particular individual, a former president, might I add? Of course, it's not just anybody, but they've been quite lenient with him up until this point. I mean, even the last summons he missed and nothing happened, and now they find themselves having to almost put the ball in the court of the Constitutional Court to say, well, you deal with this.
Well, they had to in the end, and they made a very smart move to go to the Constitutional Court a couple of months ago to seek the Constitutional Court's approval for the summons and to get an order from that court requiring former President Zuma to appear before it. That strategy worked out, and what it's done is escalate this legally, and it's really pushed Mr. Zuma into a corner legally, which is why he's now trying to escalate this into a political crisis in order to give him some bargaining power at this very last moment. I think the Zondo Commission bent over backwards to respond to your question, did everything in its power to accommodate Mr. Zuma. They were probably too gentle with him earlier on. And indeed, the Constitutional Court judgment in effect says that. It said that it probably was too gentle with Mr. Zuma. It should have been firmer right from the outset.
Is this a deliberate tactic, would you say? I mean, we are dealing now with the latest response, another 12-page letter coming from former President Jacob Zuma. He says, today, unprovoked, Deputy Chief Justice Zondo decided to propagate some political propaganda against me. In my absence, he and Pretorius SC decided on what they have always sought to do, turn all the narrative against me into evidence. In his long-prepared speech, Pretorius SC presented what Deputy Chief Justice Zondo literally called evidence against me, realizing that they had forfeited the opportunity to present the evidence to me. I mean, it goes on in that fashion. It's the kind of response that you get in the letter, while when he realizes, of course, that when you deal with these processes, they've got to be dealt with legally. The reasons, for example, given to the Commission for not showing up are completely different to what we saw in his previous response. I mean, yet again here, very clearly carving it as a political issue.
Exactly, Thabo. And that 12-page letter, which dropped into my inbox just minutes before I came on air with you, so I've merely scanned it. But it seems to me yet another step towards this, I think, very grave crisis, politically, if not legally, which is a crisis around the legitimacy or the attempt by Mr. Zuma to delegitimize the legal process, to defy the rule of law, to seek to undermine the authority not just of the Zondo Commission, which will finish its work in a few months' time, but the Constitutional Court. And in this 12-page letter, Mr. Zuma makes some outrageous suggestions in relation to the judiciary. He seems to want to say that there are some judges he likes and trusts, and he was willing to appear in front of, and there's some that he doesn't like or trust. He believes are biased against him. And of course, that type of scurrilous allegation is really going to, in some people's minds, undermine the authority of the judiciary, which is why it's grave. I do think, however, he is in a difficult position now, legally and politically. I think the Stalingrad strategy, as it's known commonly, is really beginning to run out of runway, and he's in a bit of a corner. And I think the letter is yet another indication of that his desperation. But back to your slightly earlier point about the evidence before the commission, it is evidence. And so when Mr. Zuma says it's not evidence, that's simply not true. A huge volume of evidence has been adduced before the Zondo Commission that implicates Mr. Zuma directly, which is why the Constitutional Court said it was so crucial to have him as a witness so that he had a chance to respond to those allegations and to that evidence and to rebut it if he could. The fact that he declines to do so reveals that he doesn't really have a satisfactory answer. Otherwise, as Justice Zondo said today, why would he not come here in order to clear his name and to correct the record?
Now, there are some voices who are saying that the narrative coming from whatever faction in this political fight could possibly lead this nation into something that we all don't particularly desire. In fact, there are those who would believe this narrative that former President Zuma is being hunted like a springbok, so to speak.
Well, I think that narrative is the one that's going to seek to dominate headlines in the next few days and weeks as Mr. Zuma fights for his kind of legal life, as it were, because the net is very much closing in on him and many people in his sort of crony network that he established when he had political office in the presidency. So, as I said before, their attempt now is to create a political crisis here in order to give them some bargaining power within the ANC, I suspect, and indeed with the government. Now, how that plays out really will be a test of really the balance of power within the ANC. And my estimation of that is that the Radical Economic Transformation, the RET, or the Fight Back grouping, and I'm not going to call it a faction, because a faction implies that it is a legitimate ideological faction within the ANC, which the ANC has a long tradition of. It's not that. It's a group of people desperately struggling to avoid jail, heavily implicated in many crimes of very serious corruption that dragged the democratic state almost into oblivion during the Zuma years. And that's who they are. And I believe they're a minority in the ANC, but that remains to be seen. And the ANC has some leadership, has some very tough choices to make in the coming days and weeks.
UCT's Associate Professor of Public Law, Richard Calland, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us tonight. You can be a part of this conversation too. Tag us on Twitter at Newsroom405. Send us your WhatsApp questions and comments to 072 110 5584. We'll get to those in a moment. Carl Niehaus, speaking on behalf of the Mkhonto we Sizwe Military Veterans Association, standing by to give us his reaction in a moment.